Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Thank you again for attending this Global America Business Institute GABI webinar on principles, strategies, and models for global SMR deployment. My name is Alan Ahn, Director of Programs and Communications at GABI. I am going to keep my introductory remarks very brief. Because we've received really extraordinary interest in this virtual workshop. If you've seen the handout that was sent out this morning, we are over 200 RSVPs for this event. A few quick announcements. I think we're still waiting for more people to join us this morning. We will be uploading slides and video from this conversation after the conclusion of the webinar. So if there are parts of the discussion you've missed, you can check on those after we are finished. And for the sake of streamlining the conversation due to the number of attendees we're expecting, we are turning off the raise hand function for this event. If you have questions, please submit them via the Q&A button on the bottom of your interface, and we will get to your questions as time permits. I believe we will stay on a bit past the hour in an attempt to get to everyone's questions. So it really is my pleasure to introduce our moderator today, Mr. Paul Murphy. Paul is the founder and managing director of Murphy Energy and Infrastructure Consulting. He will get the discussion started today. I hand things over to you, Paul, and I think we are in very good hands. Thanks again to you and Milt for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Alan. And, it really is exciting to do this today. Alan mentioned the attendee list, and, a lot of people, given the time zones they're in, weren't able to join. So hello to all of you that will be watching this later on recording. But, I made a list of all the people and tried to capture the countries. And of course, we have people from the United States and Canada, but also from the indigenous communities in Canada. We have Korea, Japan, Ghana, the Philippines, Mexico, Ireland, the UK, the Ukraine, India, Turkey, Singapore, Nigeria, Malaysia, France, and Belgium. And I'm sure I'm missing a few, but I think it's really exciting to see such a wide range of interest, including, people from the IAEA and the United Nations that are also, on our registration list. And I think it's a great indication of the interest in SMRs. It reflects the global interest. And, how did we get here? Why are we doing this today? And, it really started 2 weeks ago where the IAEA had an SMR workshop. It was a regional meeting that went all week, and Milt and I were both speaking early in the week. And so we got together beforehand and made sure we weren't going to talk about the same things. And, but we both had this theme of we need to think about how we can go faster, how we can really see the market created for SMRs. And I gave and Milt spoke the next day, and I think he really hit on some great points. And I asked him, can I send your slides around? I think some of you may have already seen them. And when I sent it to GABI, in typical GABI and Florence fashion, she looked at it and said, hey, would Milt be willing to talk to our audience? And, in the matter of, I think, 24 hours, we'd arranged this. And so just a huge thank you to GABI and to Florence and Alan specifically for making this happen and for doing it in such short order. And, really the theme that we want to hit on today is, there's a lot of stuff being talked about with SMRs. There's a lot about the technology development and R&D side. There's a lot of talk about theoretical opportunities and why SMRs make sense. But I think what you're going to hear from Milt today is really a focus on how to think about the business side of this, how to think about the markets and what the real opportunities are, and how do we get these interested groups to make these projects really happen. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Milt, and just a brief introduction of Milt. He's the president of MZConsulting Incorporated. He has over 40 years of nuclear industry experience, and he specializes in advising governments and utilities on how to increase confidence and reduce risk for large energy projects, with a focus on managing projects for success. Of the many projects in his career, he's currently providing independent oversight of the Darlington refurbishment program to the Ontario Minister of Energy, Northern Development and Mines. He was also a senior member of the Economics and Finance Working Group for the Canadian SMR Roadmap in late 2018 and continues to provide strategic advice to stakeholders on SMR development and deployment. He's the chair of the World Nuclear Association Economics Working Group and teaches nuclear economics and nuclear plant construction and financing for the World Nuclear University, and is the author of a pro-nuclear blog addressing issues of interest to the industry. In short, Milt's the real deal, and so we really are excited to have him talk to us today. Just again, before I turn it over to Milt, Milt's going to talk for about 20 minutes. We'll chat for maybe another 10. And we'll open it up to questions. And as Alan said, we'll try and stay on for as long as there are good questions. Obviously, people may have to drop at the end of the hour. But other than that, we'll go until no longer an interest. So with that, I thank you very much for your interest, and I'll turn it over to Milt. Milt, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Paul, and thank you, Alan and Florence and GABI, and with that kind introduction, I think you made me nervous, Paul, so we'll see how we go from here. You know, as Paul said, as I start to try and share my screen, I think I got it. I think everybody can see that okay. If not, whoops, if not, let me know. And I think, you know, we've all been on webinar after webinar after webinar in the last number of months, and we hear a lot of good stuff about SMRs and nuclear and why they're needed, and demonstration projects and technology. A lot of the discussion is focused on technology, conventional technology, advanced technology. And I think, you know, what we want to talk about today is look at a few different things and look a little bit more at how we can come around and deploy. And so really what I want to talk about in the next 20 minutes is sort of, let's define success and then talk about why SMRs, how are they different, and sort of a possible model for deployment. But really it's about bringing up some of the issues that I think are being under discussed in this overall conversation about small modular reactors. Now, although if you're logged in here, I suspect you know what an SMR is, but it doesn't hurt to have an introductory slide. So just for a common definition, they're small, less than 300 megawatts. They're modular, built in factories in large numbers. And really the objective is to reduce the risks of delay and cost overruns that we may see on larger projects by deploying them more quickly and at lower total cost. But I think of most importance, what we really want to do is expand the market to a broader customer base who can benefit from these lower cost solutions. So if we come back and start to say, well, what does success look like for SMRs? And you know, the first point is we have to remember, we can talk about all these great technology, you know, benefits and the benefits to the environment, but in the end, to really meet their full potential, they have to be cost competitive. And we have to keep our eye on the prize and focus on the economics of these new plants. And the second point I think is really critical, because often we hear people talking about, you know, the weaknesses of large plant deployment. And you know, that's a mistake. The purpose of SMRs is not to replace large nuclear plants, but to supplement them. So if SMRs are really going to succeed and make a difference in the world, then it means we have to open a new type of market to people that would have never considered a large reactor, either because the reactor was too large or the investment was too much. But it's about broadening the market to include new players that would have never considered nuclear as an option before. We understand that SMRs, to be successful, have to be deployed in large standardized fleets. There's really no benefit to building 6 in the next 40 years if we're going to make a difference on reducing carbon emissions. We have to build them, you know, first in the tens, then in the hundreds, and ultimately in the thousands. And we need to have commercial models to support this kind of infrastructure. So if we start with some basics about SMR economic principles, they're really based on the economies of numbers, modularity, and standardization for commercial deployment. And so the objective here is to make the nuclear industry more like other industries that mass produce sort of highly technical items like shipbuilding or airlines or aircraft. A fleet approach would see SMR designs built in factories, promoting standardization and learning by doing through the building of subsequent units. And that has to be more than a narrative. That has to be a model that works. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the next few minutes. But that being said, if you look at the economic drivers for SMRs, and this chart comes from the Canadian roadmap that was issued in 2018, the economic drivers are similar to large reactors. And what that means is that they're still capital intensive. And so the economics really depend on getting the capital under control. And as we've also learned with respect to large reactors, it's not just about the capital cost, which is how much does one of these plants cost, but it's about the cost of capital, or what's the interest rate or discount rate or weighted average cost of capital that you're raising money at. And these two tend to be the two most important parameters to get the economics of a nuclear plant under control, and strategies that will result in getting these two parameters to be as low as possible will give us the best outcome. So if we start by saying, how do you reduce the capital cost, which is the how much does it cost to build a plant? And very often, people will talk about how nuclear plants have gotten bigger and bigger and bigger and take advantage of economies of scale. And sometimes people are critical and say maybe we've got too big, but we have to remember the reason you can build nuclear plants that are 1,000 megawatts or 1,200 megawatts or even 1,600 megawatts is because we can. Other technologies can't make plants that are that big. It's just not feasible. And that comes down to the high density nature of nuclear fuel. So given that definitely economies of scale are real, how do we overcome that to make plants smaller? And we do that in two ways. One is we maximize standardization, supported by fleet economics using factory build and the economies of numbers. So what that means is if we build lots and lots of the same plant in the same kind of controlled environment over and over and over again, we can get their costs down. And the second part is we need to minimize the fixed costs of project development through improved processes and simplification. And we often don't talk about that, but we have to remember it takes today a long time and a lot of money to get a nuclear project going. And, if you're building a $10 billion project and it takes you, 100 million and 10 years to get ready until you get to the start of your project, that's fine. But that's not going to work if you want to build a small, more cost-effective station. Now, when we talk about standardization, and we have this discussion very often, people often are very focused on meaning we're building the same design. But standardization is so much more than that. True standardization really means you do as much as possible the same. And that means having the same supply chains, using the same equipment suppliers, the same service suppliers, the same construction methods, the same licensing models, the same training, the same operator models. Because the more that can be repeated, the lower and the more certain the cost. And one of the things we have to keep in mind is that also means you want to use the same people as much as possible, because when we learn things, learning is entrenched in people. Very often we talk about lesson learned programs, but lessons are learned by people. The simple analogy is all of us today, when we want to do something, around the house and we don't know how to do it, we go on YouTube and we can find some fantastic person who can show us how to do it. And as much as that helps, we all still know that it's definitely easier when we do it the second time. Now, how do we reduce the costs of capital? Well, the cost of capital is a measure of risk to the investor. I think everybody understands that. If you're a higher risk lender, you pay a higher interest rate than somebody who's a lower risk. If you want to raise money from an equity investor, the price they charge you for their money is related to the risk they perceive for the type of project you have. And so the way to manage that is to reduce project risks. And we need to do that in two ways. First of all, we need to develop appropriate project structures that balance risks differently than some of where we've been before. And we can talk about that during the discussion if people have questions. But it's about making sure the investors are taking a manageable amount of risk. And although we often talk about project structures, the one thing we have to remember, there's no replacement for just doing a good job, right? If we can demonstrate that we can continuously build and deliver projects to cost and schedule, then the risk gets under control and everybody feels better. Now, there's an interesting example of this. When I looked at the World Energy Outlook 2020 that came out this past November, they actually have a page or two where they talk about how solar generation has met this objective. And they've done it in the same way that we're trying to do for SMRs. They have large volume implementation of solar panels. So when you want to go and buy solar, you know exactly what it costs. They're cranking them out in large volumes. But they also have project structures in some countries supported by government policies to reduce the revenue risk components, which means the price of energy, the volume, and the off-taker risk. And we won't go into great detail on that now, but so it's that combination of having known costs and policies that allow you to manage risks. Now, before we get into the meat of this, you know, there's different models you can look at for, you know, who are the major players when you talk about developing a program. And really, I think you can break them into three sort of big groups of stakeholders. You have the government, and their role is to set policy. And the most important policy these days is we require an acknowledgement that nuclear is a clean, low carbon option that should be available to help decarbonize. And they also have to create a workable electricity market. So government sets the rules, right? They create the environment that we have to operate in. Industry is there to develop these exciting new products. You know, we have tens of developers developing all kinds of fascinating SMR products, but they have to go beyond that. They have to develop the supply chain and the delivery models. And while most of the talks you've seen in the last year or so focus on what we need from government and what we need from industry, what I really want to focus on today is what we need from the market. Because in the end, the market must lead. There's no point in governments sticking their neck out and putting out a policy to support nuclear if nobody in that country is saying, guess what, we need to build new generation, and it has to be it has to be this many megawatts, and it has to be in service, you know, January the 1st, 2032, and we're going to build something, and it's either going to be this nuclear thing or it's going to be something else, but doing nothing is not an option for us. So the market is always the one that has to lead. They have to say, I have a need, I have to do something, and I now accept that this new nuclear option is one of the things that I want to consider to meet that need. You know, we always have to make sure that we're not looking at developing these things as a big science project. What we're trying to do is decarbonize the economy by building low carbon, reliable generation. But if the market isn't taking the lead and saying, I need it, it's just not going to happen. Now, once we establish a need, there needs to be an acknowledgement that SMRs are different. There's a need for global fleets in large numbers, right? Nobody's going to undertake this process and say, well, what we're going to do is, you know, build 6 of these in the next 20 years. Some of the market studies have said, you know, by 2040, the market could be as large as 150 billion US dollars per year. That's a lot of numbers, right? And, you know, if we're going to decarbonize, then we have to build tens and hundreds and thousands of these units. And so that means 2 things. One, we have to understand that there has to be factory build, and that means rationalizing the global supply chain. And this is an important difference because for many of the people, especially in government, when they think about nuclear projects, they think about large infrastructure projects that create a tremendous amount of local economic activity. And frankly, the objective of SMRs is not to do away with that economic activity, but to reduce it, to say, you know, at the extreme, call someone up and say, I need one of these, and it'll arrive on Tuesday. That's the objective. The objective is that they're all built in a single factory somewhere, and that they're using the same people to make all the bits, no matter where it's going, and that it has a smaller number of people that are operating it. So that's one thing that has to be taken into account in the model. The other is we also have to remember that of the tens and tens of new players that are in the market developing these new designs, most of them, although not all, are new companies that have come together for the sole purpose of developing these new reactors. And they have a lot of smart folks, but none of them have demonstrated their ability to actually deliver yet. And that's where there's been a lot of focus, for example, in the US ARPA program to get demonstration plants built. But if we think about, those are the two things that really drive SMRs as being different: the need for large fleets of factory-built units, and that we're trying to make sure we can manage the risk of new players who are going to be the ones to do this delivery, then we're on the right path. Now, I'm showing this slide just to show you that, you know, in the IAEA, they have a model, this three-phase model for how a new country should be able to, the things they need to do to embark upon a nuclear program. Now, this model's for large nuclear. They don't have one for SMRs yet. They do have one for research reactors, which is shorter. But the point is that all these 19 things that have to be done to get ready for a nuclear program probably still need to be done for an SMR program. The issue you have, though, is most of the developers are focused on this phase 3, where they're trying to say, okay, I'm developing a new design that we're going to be able to implement very quickly. But we need to spend more time figuring out how we're going to both shorten and reduce the cost of these pre-project and project development activities. Because once again, you know, what market is going to spend 10 years and tens of millions of dollars so they can buy one 250 megawatt plant? It doesn't seem, it's probably not the path they're going to take. So here's the meat of it. Here's the answer. What we're suggesting is we really need to find a way so that customers, people that are actually going to be the ones who are in the business of building and owning and operating generating stations, get together and collaborate to help make this happen. Now, why should they collaborate? Because each customer's project depends upon successful fleet deployment by the developer. So in other words, you know, if a fleet includes 8 units and you're negotiating separately with the developer and you're buying unit number 7, guess what? The success of your project's completely dependent on how well they do on unit number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And so working together also creates the ability to create the fleet required. So, you know, it's, you know, there's a risk associated with going with some of these new vendors. You know, if they need to sell 20 or 30 or 40 units to really have a long-term successful business, do you really want to talk to them one-on-one and take the risk that you might be the only one or the first or the second to buy one of these units? Well, if success requires having a fleet, why not get together with other people who are like-minded and then go to a vendor and say, guess what? We're interested in building 20 plants. How about we all work with you and decide to build your design? And that way, making that decision together means you'll have a fleet. And that also reduces the risk of vendor failure, right? Because one of the issues that I've heard, I was involved in an IAEA economic mission to a country who's looking at 1 or 2 SMRs, I guess 2 years ago now, because the last year is a blur, like it is for all of us. And their question was very simple. How do I go to one of these advanced designs that maybe needs, you know, a different kind of fuel, and that only gets refueled every 10 years? if I don't know that 10 years from now that company's still going to be in existence? What if I bought the only one, or they only sold 5 of them and now they just haven't succeeded? Well, if you get together and develop a fleet, you can also get together and have enough collaboration to make sure you have ongoing technology support to meet what you need to operate those units for the long term. So in essence, when you look at a collaborative model, there's really 2 things you're trying to achieve. You're saying we want to achieve scale. And what scale does is it helps you get government support, because you're talking about, you know, we're not the only ones that want to do this. Us and 10 of our buddies want to get together and do this. And so you get that increased support from governments being able to take comfort that they're not going out on a limb. They can work together with others. You get the vendor commitment, because you're going to vendors and you're not saying, well, I might want to buy one. How about I bring you the market for the next 20 or 30 or 40 of these units, and you reduce your risk. And also what happens is you reduce your costs, because you can have a common approach to project development. You can all agree to use the same companies to do the development, to do the site investigation. You can get your regulators collaborating and sort of push them to talk to each other. And you can standardize your approach to project preparation. You know, very often if you go talk to developers about project costs, they'll all talk to you and say, oh, well, this excludes owner's costs, which are some mysterious, you know, amount of costs that people always say are unique to each project. Well, we're trying to make sure that that's different now. So as we said, if you work together to create a fleet, what you really have is you can have, you know, one customer that maybe only wants a single plant, one that wants 2 or 3, maybe you have one that wants, you know, enough to have their own small fleet. But if they all work together, all of a sudden you're now saying, well, look, we can build 10 units. We can now have a developer justify a factory that can put out the bits we need for those 10 units. But even more importantly, when you think about the potential benefits to each market, there's all the other things that need doing, and you can get together and collaborate on that, so that, you know, the same people from market A can work on all the projects from the other 3 markets, and that goes the same from people that work. So you can distribute work in a way, competitively, of course, but you can distribute it so that you can share resources, and that resources can come from each and every market, but can move from plant to plant to plant and help make this a success. So we're getting to the last couple of slides, because I know we're running a little short on time. What's a collaborative work plan? You know, let's find a way to develop a fleet model for implementation, a single program across all jurisdictions. Make sure that you're the ones that are selecting the vendor and the technology. And this is nothing against all the developers that have been doing a good job of going out there and, you know, signing up customers to do studies. But really, it should be the customer that goes out there and assesses what's available and picks. And then you can go down this list, and these are all the things that you can do together. And I think, you know, one thing I want to remind you, the nuclear industry, nothing is new in the nuclear industry about working together. One of the reasons the global fleet operates such that high capacity factors is because we have organizations like INPO and WANO, and these organizations have made sure we share globally OPEX, we work together to ensure the highest safety standards, we share best practices. We have lots of examples of how to work together in this industry. Now it's time to expand those to include the front end of how to make these projects happen. So remembering, when you go to select a vendor, it's not about technology. You know, most of the discussion in the SMR world today has been about technology. Should we go with a light water reactor? Should we go for an advanced reactor? What's the benefit of this design? What's the benefit of that design? But I think that's only one element. In the end, of course, we need to pre-screen and only consider acceptable technologies. But the real issue is not so much about whether you have the best technology. It's about whether you have a developer that can be successful in delivering its technology. So another way to put that question is, if you are looking at 5 developers and you concluded, even though they have different technologies, they're all equal. They'll all work well, they'll all operate at high capacity factors. Now, what are the things you need to assess to make a decision? And so fleet strategies and ability to support fleet build and operations, do they have access to resources? Do they have a team? And do they have the supply chain that can, create a factory environment and deliver, 10 units a year for them from 2030 to 2050? Do they have the supporting R&D infrastructure? And depending upon the need, if the market's really as big as what it can be, as a group, you can even select more than one vendor. Here in Canada, we're going on this 3-stream approach where the utilities and the provinces are all collaborating, but they're looking at more than one design to have different designs that may be suitable for different use cases. Now, I just want to mention something about project structure and financing, although it's a little bit off topic, because one of the things that people often talk about is they go, in nuclear, we have a financing problem. And, I would like to challenge everybody that thinks we have a financing problem to think about it a little bit differently. I don't think because the world has lots of money. We're in a historically low interest rate environment. There's lots of money looking for good investments. So if you start thinking about financing as an outcome rather than a problem, then you'll realize the problem is not with financing, it's developing good project structures that will give a risk profile that will attract favorable financing. And using fleet economics will help to increase confidence in program success, and that will enable the creation of a model that be able to access a pool of money that will be able to be diversified, and we'll see this as a lower risk opportunity. Now, I'll end because although we're talking about the importance of customers, yes, there is a role for government. There will always be a role for government in nuclear. And as a minimum, that role is really in 3 areas. It could be more. In a lot of countries, governments own and operate all the plants. But in 3 areas, they have to create supportive policies. At this stage, especially with all of the taxonomies and ESG issues, there has to be government acknowledgement that nuclear is a clean, low-carbon option. They have to address the long-term liabilities, because nuclear, we have to accept, it's different than other industrial plants. You can't have an operator go bankrupt, put the key in the door, and abandon a site. Then as long as there's radioactive material there, the government has to step in. And so that means it's in their best interest to have a long-term plan for waste and decommissioning. And they have to make sure there's an independent regulator in place to be licensing body and ensure nuclear safety. We need to have regulatory collaboration, which would be very beneficial, and I won't go into more detail. And it's also the government's responsibility to create a workable electricity market. So it's not for them to pick winners and losers, but it's for them to create an environment in which these types of projects that have these types of attributes can successfully compete. So in summary, before we start our discussion, I just wanted to say SMRs are a viable option for future electricity generation that's low carbon, reliable, and economic. Success is predicated on deploying large fleets to reduce both costs and risks. Market development is really key at this stage of the process to drive SMR new build. It's not enough to say they've done studies that show there's this massive market in the future. If we want to make sure a lot of units get built in the next 10 years, we got to start knowing the name and address of every single person that wants to build one of them. And then if we can get these people to work together to collaborate, there can be a really big opportunity to reduce costs and risk and develop the fleet required for success. So that's a good place for me to stop. And hopefully I've given you something to think about. And now I'll stop sharing, Paul, so that you can initiate some discussion. So thank you all very much for listening.
Thanks so much, Milt. Milt, just check your email real quick.
righty?
We have a lot of questions, and as I noted, we'll try and get to as many of these as possible. But one of the questions that came through, and something that you and Milt and I, we've talked about before, how does this collaboration come together? What becomes the forcing function? Is it governments? Is it the vendors? Is it countries? Is it utilities in the countries that would be the hosts of these projects? Where do you see this idea of the market coalescing to create this group of interested parties that would be on the customer side?
Well, I mean, it's a good question, Paul, and I think it really has to come from the need, right? It has to be supported by government, but governments are only going to go so far as long as, unless they feel that within their country, someone's pressing them and saying, and coming up to them and saying, look, we need to build, 2,000 megawatts of new generation between 2030 and 2035. We'd like to consider these as one of the options. We need you to help us have supportive policies, because we all know that nuclear is, somewhat controversial in some places. And, why should governments stick their neck out if nobody's beating their door down and saying, we need it, we need to build it? So it's really about getting people together. If you look at the example here in Canada, I think what's happened is we have a combination, because in Canada, as in the US, electricity generation is not at the federal level, it's at the provincial level, equivalent to the state level. And we have right now a memorandum of understanding signed between the provinces of New Brunswick, Ontario, and Saskatchewan. The province of Alberta will probably be joining in the next few weeks. And they're saying, we want to collaborate to work on this together because we see the benefit of looking at a fleet model. And then we have the 4 utilities. We have New Brunswick Power, we have Ontario Power Generation, Bruce Power, and Sask Power, all saying we want to work together to figure out how to make this happen. And even down to the point now where OPG is saying, well, we are looking at, how are we going to make a selection to build the first of these units at the Darlington site? One of the key criteria is, well, and we're going to pick something that, for example, the people in Saskatchewan are going to then follow on with, and we know they need, new units, every 3 years starting in 2032. And if this isn't an option, they'll do something else.
Mm-hmm. I mean, going to the Canadian theme for just a minute, there's the Can-Do Owners Group that's been organized around the fleet, and that's something that is both within Canada and also involving, Can-Do owners outside of Canada. I mean, how did that come together, and has it been effective? And are there some lessons that can be learned from COG? Milt, you're on mute.
Have to be told that at least once every talk, right?
There you go.
Sorry, I was trying to control some of the background noise. That's what happens when you live in a condo and you have a partner who's also on their Zoom calls, right? So I apologize for that. But I think the Can-Do Owners Group is an interesting model because, again, it's somewhat unique compared to some of the light water reactor user groups. They've created a model where there's 2 benefits. One is it's similar to INPO in the sense of having ongoing sharing of OPEX to enable best practices to be shared and be able to make sure that all owners of this particular technology can operate their units to the highest possible standard. But another thing that they do well is they have this concept of joint projects where, 2 utilities that operate the similar type of plant can come to them and say, we're trying to solve a similar issue. And they create a joint project and say, instead of each of us go out for tender to find somebody to help us solve this problem, let's do it together. And guess what? We each pay half and we're all better off. And so I think as a model, they've been able to demonstrate that working together not only increases the quality of the outcomes, but it also reduces the cost to all the members. So again, I find that to be an interesting model.
Mhm, mhm. In terms of models and collaboration, we've had a few questions that relate to the airline industry, and some of the collaborations that have occurred there in terms of aircraft engine maintenance and pool styles of maintenance, as well as obviously the standardization of aircraft designs and the recognition of not having to get licensed in every country that may want an aircraft, and leading to the success of things like Boeing and Airbus and others. What kind of lessons do you think can be taken from the airline industry as we get into these ideas of almost an off-the-shelf type model for SMRs to create the volumes that we need for these companies to survive?
Well, I mean, there are lessons, although I don't know if we'll ever get to the point where we're as commoditized as they are. I mean, you have to remember in the airline industry, you have there's a number of players, but you have two big players, and, people buy off the shelf designs. But for example, when they're developing a new design, either Boeing or Airbus, they tend to develop it. They get customers on board early, and they have a minimum of hundreds of orders before they decide to go into production, right? That's a requirement to go into production, is to have an order book, not the other way around. There's a lot of lessons on the regulatory front, and that comes from the fact that, planes take off from one place and land in another, and so they can't have to meet different rules, from the start of your journey to the end. But they have the standard manufacture, and even though they're built in factories that are located in a small number of places, parts distribution does come from many other markets. It's not unheard of that, if some country gives a big order for aircraft, certain parts will get, more built in their own country. So I think there are good lessons to be learned, but there's also differences that we have to take into account. So we should learn wherever we can. And I think the one thing that's really important, Paul, is that in the nuclear industry, we tend not to look outside of our own industry often enough to learn from what others are doing. We tend to have a little bit of arrogance and think we know best and we're different, and people need to understand why we're different. I think it would be really useful to learn from what others are doing.
You touched upon the need for harmonization, and we've had a number of questions on various aspects of this point about how important is it for harmonization of regulatory standards, licensing processes, recognition of design certifications, various levels of the question. But running through the theme of the questions that are coming through, there's this well, how do we actually achieve the harmonization? And does that really reside at a government level? And getting back to your point about there's a critical role for governments to play, or if you have these customers coalesce around, hey, we want to do this, and let's standardize, does that also become a forcing function in some way? How do we sort of get to that regulatory harmony, recognizing that you mentioned arrogance, and to take an honest look, some regulators do have, whether it's arrogance or territoriality or what's the right word, the idea that some regulators would just harmonize. Is that more something for newcomer countries, or do you see maybe some of the recognized and established regulators achieving that harmony?
Well, it's an important question, and there's two parts to it. One is, I'm one of those people that's reluctant to say we're doing everything right in the industry, and if only everybody around us would get their act together, we'd be better off. Yes, it's important to harmonize as much as possible. I think in the past, we've actually seen that in countries that have come along later, right? Because once the industry was more established, if country X, their first plant was going to be, an American-made PWR, then the way they developed their regulatory system was learning from the NRC and training from the NRC. If, the countries that have Canadian can-dos, they all went to the Canadian regulator and got advice on how to regulate. You do have some of the bigger countries that have vast differences. Sort of the UK has, is a good example of where the rules can be very different. But I think when it comes down to this, the pressure has to come from the industry and from the customers themselves, because, if someone's going to go, sure, you can pre-license, the EPR in the UK and spend, years getting a generic design approval that's different than what they've got in France or what they've got in China. And it still makes sense because they're built, they built 2 of them and it's 3,000 megawatts. Nobody's going to do that to say in some country, well, we're going to start off by building, one 300 megawatt plant, and hopefully over 20 years we'll build 5 of them. Mm-hmm. It's just not on, right? The breadth is not there, and they're going to have to find ways to make it manageable. But I think the other thing is there's an important message, which I often hear from one of the fellows in the CNSC here, who always says when asked, well, you need to make the processes more streamlined and faster. And he always responds and says, I'm happy to consider that. But, my responsibility is public safety. For me to consider that as a developer, you need to come to me and show me why your design merits that. I'm not just going to, on my own say, oh, yeah, it used to take 5 years to do this. Guess what? I'll come up with a process to take 2. No worries, right? You got to show me why I can still meet the safety requirements with these new improved methods.
We just had a question come in that I think is a really interesting one when we talk about standardization and rapid deployment. And it, when you look at various sources, just in North America alone, there's probably, if you count SMRs, advanced reactors, microreactors, and fusion, 60-something developers of various technologies. And if we're trying to get to this harmonization and fleet approach, how do we cull the herd and focus on a few designs? Is that something that government should be involved in? Is that really the market deciding? Is it some combination of the two? But, there's no way that all of these vendors could possibly survive or be regulated or to standardize the regulation across all of the different types of fuel types and design. So how do we deal with, on the one hand, this enthusiasm on the technology development side that, looks great, but then from a business point, well, we need stuff that can be sold and sold relatively soon and sold at volume.
Yeah, so again, that's the challenge. And so the model to date has been that the developers have all been rushing to get money, either private or government, and try and be the first to build a demonstration unit. I think fundamentally that's been the model. I think if you go to any specific developer, they feel comfortable that if I can get one committed and built, whether it's under the ARPA program, or it's under a Canadian program, or it's Rolls-Royce in the UK, if I can get someone to get something built, that'll give me a big market lead. I think what we're advocating for here, though, is we need more than that, because getting one built at this point is much more focused on demonstrating the technology works than demonstrating the business model or demonstrating the commercial model or how the fleet model would work. So if you can get customers together and they go out and come up with a procurement approach, it reduces their risk if they can say, and then they pick 1 or 2, or, let's face it, if the market really is 150 billion a year, then, there can be numerous vendors, there doesn't have to be 1 or 2, there could be 3 or 5 or 7. I don't know the right answer, but if the market comes together and goes through a process and says, okay, we're going to now put together a plan that says if all goes well, we're going to support the first commercial deployment of Model X. But if it goes well, we can see a path where, we're going to bring you the next 20 or whatever the right number is. That greatly increases the chance of success. And, those developers that succeed will obviously be ahead of the game. that doesn't mean if this is a robust enough technology that, those that succeed first, maybe 15 years from now, some new idea comes that is a much better idea, and all of a sudden you get a new entry into the fold. All that is possible.
Milt, we have a really good question on sort of, we talk about the market and really a bit of a focus on the electricity market. And we've had, privatization or deregulation of electricity markets, which we've seen in a lot of instances make nuclear projects very hard to develop and continue to operate. So, how do we get these products into what could be otherwise be perceived as challenging markets? Is this something where we need regulated structures? Do we need, things that are being considered in places like the UK with contract for differences or regulated asset-based models? Or, can there be sort of a P3 type model or an IPP type model, maybe where you have a power purchase agreement backed by a sovereign? What do we do on the economic side? Let's assume that we have something ready to sell, but how do we create the environment that creates a financeable project in that market and create the right environment for the investment community to come in and support it?
Well, to have a thorough discussion on this topic, Paul, would take much more time than we have left. I see we're sort of getting near the end. But fundamentally, deregulated markets have failed in the sense that they cannot support this type of new product development. We've seen it. All the renewables, even though people argue that renewables are cheaper than they've ever been, are still incentivized outside of the markets and have, policy support in place. The markets have really been developed in a time when they were gas markets. And, if you look at who wins in these markets, it's always gas vendors, because they're always market makers. They're never market takers, right? Everyone else is really, in the most deregulated markets where there's a lot of gas, everyone else is just competing on a daily basis with gas. The gas guys get capacity payments to cover their cost of building a plant, and they burn gas and get recovery on the cost of fuel. So new models have to be made. But what's important in the model, when you look at the regulated asset-based model in the UK, or a traditional regulated North American model as you use in, with Southern Company or up here in Ontario, it's really about getting the risk distribution right. We have this perceived notion of a PPA means a certain pricing model, that it means, the price is, 48 cents a kilowatt hour plus escalation. But in reality, a PPA can be anything, right? A PPA just means we have an agreement. I have energy, you're going to buy it. You can agree to pay me full cost. You can agree to, so it's about getting to models that has the right balance of risk, because in the end, complex models increase the cost of capital. Increased cost of capitals greatly reduce the economic benefits of these plants. And you have to make sure that the model you have is not just an illusion, right? Because we know a lot of these projects are, you want them to succeed. And the fact if they're starting to fail, even though someone said they're taking all this risk and are charging you for it, they either abandon or they come to you and beg you for more money. So there's a lot of work going on. The UK is a good example where they sort of can compare the outcome of the RAB model to their contract for difference model. And you can see calculations in some of the presentations about the great difference. And again, if you look at the World Energy Outlook, just the differences in policy approaches to solar, the rate of interest ranges from like 2% to 7%, depending on the model. And the cost of energy, moves very rapidly with that change in cost. I think we'll leave it there because, like I said, we can have, a 2-hour talk just on this one topic.
No, thanks, Milt. I'm just going to pause for a second and just say we're coming up on the hour, and we know that people have to drop. We still have a lot of questions, and we're going to keep plowing on. This is being recorded, so for those of you that do have to drop, you can pick up and see the remaining answers to questions as they come in. But we're going to keep going. But maybe just a very quick one, Milt, for those who do have to drop. And, I obviously found this to be very compelling in terms of this idea of bringing the customers together. Where do you go from here with this beyond this presentation? What are some of the next steps, you think?
Well, I mean, as we've discussed, we're thinking about, writing a paper that in the coming weeks that again, Alan and Florence have kindly offered to publish once we get around to it. But I think it's more about looking at what's already happening and how to build on that, right? Like I said, in the UK, that's what Rolls-Royce has done. They've gone to the government and said, here's our model. We're going to build a factory and we want you to approve a fleet of 16 units. Maybe that will work. Mm-hmm. In Canada, we've got an approach that said we're going to get all the interested utilities in the country to work together to try and make decisions in a unified way. And I'm hoping that will work because that's where I live. But, maybe they'll be interested in having others who would want to be the next tier of customers say, hey, can we monitor that process and can we participate so that we can see what's going on and learn from that. You have the program in the US, the ARPA program, which is extraordinarily important, right? You have just this past week, X-Energy said they've signed an agreement, to get their funding in place and build their first demonstration plant. So we now have willing hosts for demonstration plants in different places. And we're not even talking about, what the others, the Chinese, the Russians are doing, but we have willing hosts. It's really about starting to shake loose those markets where people never thought about it before, and how do we get those people engaged? Because if you're in, Africa or Southeast Asia or Eastern Europe or, who knows where, South America, and you have growing demand, and in the 2030s and 2040s, you've done analysis that says you got to add X number of megawatts to the grid. How do you get those people engaged to say, well, before I thought my only options were, renewables and maybe gas or coal or diesel or whatever I have available. This is now an option. And what do I need to do to start making that a real option in my consideration? And the only way I can do that as a newcomer is to work with others, because otherwise I don't know where to start. The IAEA can have a role, of course, in helping, but I need to work with others because I need to be ready. Mm-hmm. And one of the issues with big units has always been when people are trying to make decisions, back when I was younger, between say a coal plant and a nuclear plant, the nuclear plant always took longer to develop. And so it always was the option that fell off the table first if time was running out. I have to say, my experience, I have a lot of experience in Korea. One of the reasons the Korean program in those days was so successful is because, they had a driver. It was, we need a plant that has to be in service on this day in this year, and we will be building something. End of story. And they always met that target.
Mm-hmm. I mean, when you think about everyone coming together, is part of the message here that a lot of the analysis that's even needs to be done within an IAEA framework, a lot of that could be standardized. A lot of the technology assessments, what are my options, what might project models and financing options be, is part of the theory that a lot of that doesn't need to be done by every country, but that a lot of it could be harmonized such that, it's one analysis by a group of experts on technology readiness and options. And then countries can adjust to their site-specific conditions or country conditions from there. But it would seem that a lot of this stuff could be shared information so that each country is not having to do it on its own. Is that a part of this?
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. Paul, that's the idea is a lot of this upfront work is laborious, it's time consuming, it's expensive. You need to be able to take from what others are doing, right? And in theory, that was one of the original drivers of going to 10 CFR Part 52 from Part 50, right? It was let's license sites independently of products, let's license standard products, and then let's, you know, modify what we need to when we get to a specific site and address that. Has it worked? It's still a work in progress, and we can talk about those things, and there's lessons to be learned from that. But the objective has to be, you know, not just looking at those 19 things, you know, in the IEA model, but it's to say for item number 3 and 5 and 7, there's a standard report on the shelf, and in it, it tells me chapter 7 is put in the things that are unique to me, and the other things should apply to me, right? And that's the only way we can get going, because how do you get people to sort of start down this path of going nuclear, especially if they want to do it with smaller things, if, you know, it takes them 10, 15 years just to figure out how to set up enough of a domestic infrastructure to be in a position to do it. I mean, you've often said in your talks, because I always listen when you're talking, that the UAE did a wonderful job and it took them 15 years from beginning to end. And that's for 4 big units, but you know, we need to do even better than that, right? So that's the challenge.
I don't want to ignore all the questions on fuel, so I'm just going to jump to that because there have been a lot of good questions coming in about fuel issues. And Milt, you touched upon it a bit in your opening remarks, but there was a question about the TRIGO reactor program and how, you know, the fuel supply went away there. And, you know, for these advanced reactor designs, the need for HALEU and limited supply sources for that. So in terms of fuel side concerns, for any of the designs and for the market and the customer base feeling that there's support for the fuel side of things going forward, how do you integrate that into your analysis, and how could these types of ideas be helpful, if at all?
Well, and this is where you have the challenge, because you have sort of, if you could think of fuel in 3 groups, you have those SMRs that will use very traditional, standard, off-the-shelf LWR fuel, maybe a different length, or, you know, but you can get somebody to make it, you know, no matter what. Then you have the more advanced fuels that either need HALEU or they're in a funny, or not a funny, but a different configuration, triso pellets or molten salts, and you have to be able to support that. And then you have some of those advanced reactors that need to be refueled very, very infrequently, which creates its own issues, right? Because, you know, even if you have a big enough fleet, if, you know, if they all get their first set of fuel in the first 10 years and then you don't sell a lot of new units, and, you know, 20 years from now, they all need to be refueled and nobody makes that anymore, how do you solve that? Mm-hmm. So I think the answer really, I think the answer, this is a suitable model, because if you can develop a fleet, the question is, what's the minimum number of units you need to deploy in a given technology so that the owners of those units, it will be in their, say the fuel supply falls away, they can invest in developing, buying whatever fuel manufacturing plant is available, but it will be cost effective, although not maybe as cost effective as if there were more, but it's still in their best interest. You know, there's been a factory developed that can support the fuel needs of 20 units, and they can support that because there are 20 units, right? The whole HALEU issue is a different issue, but I mean, in the end, enrichers will, if someone wants to buy it, I don't see why enrichers wouldn't do it once you get started and there's a market for it. But that's the real issue that came up when I had this economic mission from, you know, a smaller country that said, that's what I'm concerned about. How do I buy something that deviates more from what's been historically available? and not feel that I'm out there alone if, that particular vendor, for whatever reason, doesn't end up having a long-term successful program. And the answer is, before you buy it, help them have a long-term successful program.
There's a question that came in about, some of the unpredictability of government support. You talked about the need for recognition of nuclear as a clean energy option. But the sort of debate between government and market and what are the forcing functions in all of this, how do you see this idea of bringing together a customer base? Is that a way to possibly insulate from changing governments and changing political agendas within certain countries? Does that somehow get us beyond that, or is it still something that has to be dealt with? But maybe if these market forces are there, it helps to maybe counterbalance some of the political risk associated with the joys of democracy and changing over different governments based on election cycles.
Well, that's always a challenge. I mean, the objective needs to be to depoliticize this to the extent possible, but it's easier said than done. I mean, we're all living in a time where the geopolitical realities, we're seeing sort of big changes and people wanting to make sure, we're in the lead or we're not in the lead, or, we're worried about that country getting too powerful or this country, getting too much of the market. But in the end, we can only depoliticize it so much by making products smaller. There's less issue, for example, with people building research reactors. We build them in universities, we build them in countries that people would be very surprised to find some countries that have research reactors, and we're less concerned. We need to sort of turn down the heat. And that being said, every other form of generation has political influence as well. People can get the gas turned off. There's policy decisions that can, decide we're no longer going to allow you to burn coal. There's policy can affect everything. It's just that for a variety of reasons, policy has affected most things here, and nuclear has always been here. If we can somehow get it into the same policy framework as most other energy issues and not have people think it's special, because when people have that thinking it's special, it's because they think it's something that requires more safeguards because it's scary, right? And that's really not the case.
Yeah, there's a great question that just came in, and it touches on national planning, and I'm just going to read this one direct. For a large developing economy like India, how do you look at advanced SMRs fitting into the energy mix with an aggressive roadmap of renewables within the COP framework? And then secondly, again, specific to India, as they transition from fossil fuels to renewables, India embarked upon a gas-based economy. How do SMRs fit into all of that, where you're seeing these big pushes for renewables and for gas? Where is the place for SMRs in all of this?
Well, and that's an interesting question, right? Because India is somewhat unique because, of course, the market is massive, right? So their problem is not, worrying about building too much. It's about not building quickly enough and not deploying quickly enough. They haven't been able to meet some of the targets set sort of a decade ago in terms of how quickly they wanted to deploy. That being said, they're also very, very successful. They have their own designs. Most of them, really, you can call them SMRs. They built a whole fleet of 220 megawatt units. They've also opened up to some international designs. I think, there'll certainly always be a market for large units in a country like India, but the diversity of the country, there may be a lot of spots. There's a lot of people where access to electricity is limited, although that's improved dramatically in recent years. And maybe to help get those areas electrified faster, SMRs will be an excellent way to go about that. I think India has the internal capability from a technology position, And it's really, and it has the size of the market similar to a China or a Russia that, can make its own decisions. It's really about deciding how much they want to interact with the rest of the world and maybe even become a source, an important source of components. They have some, amazing supply chain organizations.
Milt, is there a story in here too, perhaps about not just focusing on putting electricity in the grid, but maybe using SMRs for more applications-based processes, hydrogen production, desalination, industrial heat, inside defense industrial parks, those kinds of things? Is that something where you could see SMRs playing a key role, whether it's a smaller economy or a larger one like India, whether it's a country that has no nuclear, one that already has large reactors and might still be doing large reactors, but, are there other ways to think about how SMRs might come together in these application-based products? And does that create maybe another opportunity to bring together interested parties that may not be common to the nuclear space, but on the industrial side?
Well, that's a great question, Paul. And just to step back, I've sort of simplified it into what we've been talking about today is really grid scale SMRs. I didn't really talk about the micro reactors for the sort of remote community off-grid type of stuff because I certainly think that the market for those is very different than the market for on-grid, because on-grid, it's sort of an evolution, right? It's companies whose main business is to generate electricity, and they're going to now have a new option of something different compared to the other options they have. The off-grid is much more related to supporting mining and other sorts of industries where their energy is an input to their main business, and so the market approach to that is very different. That being said, there's still, going from the small size all the way up to the larger SMR size, the whole market for high quality steam for industrial processes. And again, you have to break it down into two groups. Like a lot of the people looking at, say, SMRs for hydrogen are looking at using electrolyzers, which mean you're still basically driving it off of electricity. Then you have, applications where the high temperature steam from advanced reactors is an extremely important input. All of these things need to be considered. In fact, I understand a study is coming out soon, so I can't comment on it, that sort of suggests the market for steam might be greater than people have been thinking. So yes, we have to do all those things. But again, with the caveat, the important thing is to get the low-hanging fruit and get going. The one thing we have a tendency to do is, we start looking at this and say, okay, we're going to meet this market need. And then we start, we have a great idea. Let's look at, now we can study for the next 10 years about the hydrogen economy. And then we can study about this. And those are all great things, as long as they don't slow us down from getting going and deploying SMRs as quickly as possible.
In terms of the getting going, there was a question about, proof of concept, the demonstration project. How important is that as part of this process? Is that, we've been focused more on the market side, and away from the technology development side intentionally, but that kind of does bring us back to the technology development side, and moving from, the paper reactor to something that people can touch and feel and see and know that it works. How critical a step is that in the process, in terms of if this coalition of end users is evaluating options, does that start to become one of those threshold issues, a go, no-go decision on a particular technology? And then similarly for the countries that are developing these technologies, is that also a place where government can play a key role in getting the demonstration project built, or even taking it further, something that you and I have talked about a lot, getting that specialized factory built before maybe the order book is even fully robust enough to justify building the factory?
Well, again, it's an important question because we tend to be very focused. When we say demonstrating the technology, I think what people mean most often is just proving it works. I I'm far less concerned about that. The history is that there's no doubt in my mind that, a triso-fueled reactor will work, a salt reactor will work. I'm sure they'll all work. So the question is, what do we really need to demonstrate, right? Because, one can then argue, well, okay, we built this demonstration plant so we can start building more, but then someone will say, oh, no, until it's operated for 10 years, we don't know if there's going to be engineering issues it's going to be able to operate reliably. Where does it end, right? Do you have to have a unit that's operated 40 years and then you can say, yes, I know so the issue, because, some of the history and some of these designs have been material issues, corrosion issues. Certain types of plants have operated in the past, but then, stopped operating after a period of time because of issues that could be fixed, given engineering. But the one thing we don't want to do is demonstrate that we can build a plant that's not economic and takes a long time to build, and we don't have a fleet model, right? So yes, we have to demonstrate, but we have to be careful to make sure we're demonstrating the right things. And yes, we understand that the first of a kind plant will cost more and take longer than subsequent plants, but we have to be able to demonstrate how we get from here to there. If all we're demonstrating is we did everything the old-fashioned way and we were able to buy parts and put them together and power comes out, we have to be careful. It just doesn't give fuel to people saying, well, look, but it took twice as long as the plan and it was really, really expensive.
Right. One of the questions that came through about economic viability, you talked about the economies of multiples, and, by bringing together a bunch of customers, maybe we can, create the order book to get to those economies of multiples on the delivery side. But, there's a question that came through that was asking, but, for an individual customer, do you need multiple SMRs for that to make economic sense? Or, by being part, if you only need one, is there still an economic case for that in this context of maybe joining up with a fleet approach where others are involved, but for you as an end user, you just still have the one? How do those economies start to work at the project level for that individual customer?
Well, and again, I think you've hit it right on, because there's two types of markets, right? There's markets where they'll want to build a fleet of small units because big units are just too much to chew at one time, right? They don't have the type of companies that can, do a $20 billion project. But still, over time, they say you need to have 6 or 8 or 10 or however many. And that's one approach. Then you have the smaller markets that may need 1 or 2, or maybe the second one's 10 years later. And hopefully we can find a model that by collaborating, they can develop less of their own domestic infrastructure, ride on the coattails of others, and we can have a model where they develop sufficient infrastructure so that their governments are comfortable that they're doing the right things and keeping their people safe. But maybe there's, an owner operator that owns, 15 units in 4 different countries, and people have a lot of comfort that these people are capable and they do it. But again, with the watch out, you still always need to develop local people to operate these units. When people say, well, often, people will say, well, I think what happened, it took a little longer for UAE to get their operators up to speed. I thought the Koreans were going to operate it. Nuclear plants, there's not a union hall somewhere of a bunch of men and women sitting and smoking every day going, is someone going to call me up? I need an operator today, right? That's not the model. So
there's just a question that came in, really thoughtful one, that was sort of asking, is there a model? We've tended to focus on the customers and coalescing to develop the fleet, but is there a sort of a build, own, operate model where, effectively the vendor is bringing the technology and offering to sell the electricity, the steam, the heat, whatever it is, um, into the market, to a customer base, but, taking the responsibility for delivery risk and operating risk. And so that it's really just the customers coming together as off takers. And, I want to touch upon it. I don't know if you remember the mining event that we did at PDAC back in, I think it was 2018, where we sort of heard this from the mining community up in Canada saying, we're really interested in SMRs, but we don't want to own them. We don't want to operate them. We'll buy the electricity, but you guys, you figure the rest of it out. How do you see that model possibly coming together within some of the ideas you've been talking about today?
So maybe this is a good place to sort of start to get near the end. But I think the answer is yes, you can have an organization that owns and operates units, and that's their role. They own and operate units all over the place. I think where we have to separate it, it definitely does not have to be the vendor. I think where a lot of these BOT models have failed is that vendors, it's not their business. Their business is, they might be a developer. If you look at the UK report that came out under the same acronym, but I can't remember what it means, EWFG, but led by Fiona, that says there's a developer, there's a factory development, that could be a different company, and then there's project developers. So it doesn't have to be the developer who's the owner and operator. It could be a company that's set up for that purpose.
Mm-hmm.
But that being said, I think we have to be careful of the narrative that says, I'm a customer. Yes, I'm kind of interested in getting one of these things, but I want to close my eyes. I don't want to know it's a nuclear plant. It's a black box, because nuclear kind of scares me. Mm-hmm. I think if that's where we get to, we've kind of failed, right? What we really want is for customers to go, this thing is bloody awesome. Of course I want to play a role. Now, that doesn't mean that role isn't as an informed customer and they bring in, SMR operator company number 3, who's, the best operator in the world. But the objective should be that people should be attracted to wanting to be involved in this, and models are possible. So I think a good way to wrap this up, Paul, is a lot of the questions have been, can this model work? Can that model work? Can this approach? I think the main issue for today is that we need to start recognizing that not enough attention is going into these issues. And that's why we don't yet have the answers, right? I mean, a lot of attention, and the limited funding is going into, let's design, the nuclear part of the plant and get it through licensing. But if we really want to be successful in the market, we need to start doing the thinking, and ideas will evolve. Whatever idea we said today, once we spend some time and working on it, maybe in 6 months, it'll look completely different. Mm-hmm. But the one thing I know for sure, if people don't start spending time and effort, and that means putting budget into, these areas of market development, it's not going to happen.
I think that's a great unintentional wrap up, and I think we've kind of exhausted you with all these questions. So thank you for being so patient and taking all these great questions that we've had. Special thank you to everyone in the Asian time zones. We know it's very, very late for you, so thanks for staying on. And at this point, Alan, I'll hand it back to you with, again, a big thank you first to Milt for all of these thoughts and the presentation and the answers. And then, of course, to our audience, thank you so much for being with us today. And then to GABI, Florence and Alan and everyone at GABI, thank you for supporting this discussion and all the things that you do to support these types of events for the nuclear industry. So thank you very much. Alan, back to you.
Yeah, and just before you go, Alan, I just want to have an opportunity to thank you as well, because this was great fun for me. I really appreciated being asked. I think for especially those that already know me, they know between me and Paul, we both love to talk. So it's easy to have this discussion, and I'm always happy to be contacted by anybody to continue the discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you both. Tremendous discussion, and also for going over time a bit. I think a lot of food for thought for future discussions. For our attendees, thank you all for attending. I know many of you have left already. I don't think the numbers are visible to everyone joining us, but this has been by far the largest turnout we've had for webinar. So thank you all for attending, for joining us at odd hours, for your excellent questions, and apologies for undertaking some draconian measures just given the special constraints that we were facing today. If you followed GABI for some time, you know that we are relentless in pushing these conversations, so please do keep an eye out for future discussions and announcements. Wherever you are, have a good rest of your day or a good night, and thank you so much for your time again today.